Hello everyone, I'm Dan the Man. Well, we started this week looking like James was a goner, but the tide turned as it often does, and Natalie went home instead. Really not much to say about the vote this week. Everyone pretty much knew with Victor one head of household that either Natalie or James would go. It was possible, although not likely, if Natalie or James won the veto, they could have gotten Victor and Paul to turn on Corey and Nicole. But that was not likely to happen, and was a moot point since the veto was never used. I would be remiss not to touch up on Natalie's behavior though. They showed a lot of it, but not all, and some argue Natalie got it good at it despite coming off bad, especially in the Eviction episode. From the beginning of Natalie and James' showmance, there's been an ongoing debate between fans over whether or not Natalie was using James. Some said she was a user and her behavior was fake, others said it was the real deal. While only Natalie knows how she really feels about James, it would seem, at least to a point, she was in fact using him. Once she and James went up, Natalie's behavior changed. A lot. For one, she would not stop throwing in James' face that it was his idea not to trust Victor and Paul, and now they're suffering for it. I make it no secret I think they are, in fact, in the mess they are in, mostly because of James, so I think as a whole she was right. But she blamed him constantly. It never stopped. She went on and on about how they should have trusted Victor and Paul, and it was James' fault they turned on them, and that is why one of them was going. He obviously didn't mean to tank their game, and while it would be understandable to vent and lash out at first, clearly she decided to make herself feel better by punishing James for it, and that's just childish. There is only so much he could apologize for something before it becomes her problem for holding the grudge in the first place. Then there was the fact she campaigned. Now honestly, she has the right to want to stay. Showmancers are not required to give up trying to win for someone that they have known for 3 months tops. But to say she's going to tell them to keep him and then go up and throw him under the bus is just shitty behavior. And they didn't show it, but Natalie basically told James she wasn't wanting a relationship. Unlike some girls this season, Natalie has not exactly been grinding up against James and having sex with him, so he probably was getting too caught up to think because they had a glorified flirting relationship that she was his future soulmate. But it was beyond convenient Natalie waited until he couldn't do anything for her anymore, and it might help her game to distance herself from him to finally tell him the truth. Then there was her telling him she would never talk to him again if he worked with Corey and Nicole after she was gone. For whatever it's worth, she did apologize for it multiple times, and maybe was just upset and never meant it. But that was when James was finally realizing he might have been used. The other thing that happened, that was not shown but worth mentioning, was huge and seemed to be the major turning point to James finally seeing he and Natalie may not be meant to be outside the house. Someone somehow got into the lot with a bullhorn and using it near the wall, got the house guest's attention and shouted, "James and Nicole had a pre-game Final Two deal." As the brigade once said, "Grenade!" The feeds went down immediately after, and when they came back we found out that James and Natalie had a big blowout, and James finally had enough and went off on her. Can't blame him for after having to hear "I told you so" all week, he didn't want to have her throw this in his face if it wasn't true. Although I guess it could be argued he didn't seem to find the nerve to do that until Natalie got mad about accusations he and Nicole had a pre-game deal. So maybe he just wanted to shut it down. Because while I don't believe for a second BB would kick them out for something like that, it is against the rule to make such deals before the game. So did they have a deal? Who knows? Fans have been speculating for a while due to the fact no matter what happens, and them seeming to not be top allies a lot of the time, they still seem to have each other's backs in the end. Things like James stepping down from the head of household competition despite Nicole having no reason to trust him and then not going up on the block, Nicole changing Victor as Paul's minds about James being the target, and other things. I could analyze the whole list of accusations and mention my thoughts on each point, but honestly I'm too lazy. It could be true, but it could also be true that James and Nicole knowing each other outside the house could be a factor. And the truth is, if they did make a pre-Final Two deal, it would not be the first time someone has done something like that. That kind of thing has happened on Big Brother and Survivor before. The show tells them not to make pre-game deals, but there's no real way they could stop them from doing it anyway, and with the kind of money and fame that's on the line, it's going to happen. Is it fair? Not really, but it is what it is. Reality shows are not fair. It's just the way it is. And in truth, most are more upset at the idea because a lot of fans don't like Nicole and have turned on James due to his disappointing performance. Before getting to the eviction, I do want to touch up on one thing that did surprise me, and that's the jury house scene in the Eviction episode. I was really surprised they showed Michelle telling everyone Paul called her the C word. I don't remember that being aired on the episodes, although it is true he called her that. Michelle's telling the truth about that one for once. But the editors seemed to want us to like Paul, which was to me the obvious reason it didn't air the first time. So I'm surprised they would show Michelle brought it up now. All I can figure is with the jury being all women except for Paulie at the moment, it's possible that they're not happy to hear that, and if Paul makes the Final Two, it might affect his chances of winning. So they're showing it to help cover why he would lose in the event that does happen. although it would be kind of surprising if he lost just for that. Not that it isn't unnecessary to be using language like that, but it's not a new development that people call each other nasty things in anger in the Big Brother house, so it seemed weird if he lost for that reason. So with all that out of the way, on to the actual eviction episode. Was Natalie the right choice? Well, for Victor and Paul, not really. They were counting on the Final Four alliance sticking together, which they found out was a bad assumption, but more on that in a minute. But even if the Final Four had stuck together, there was no guarantee that whoever survived wouldn't win the next head of household. Natalie would likely not put up Victor and Paul if she won head of household. James would. Natalie also would have likely stuck with them if they wanted to take a shot at Nicole and Corey next week had one of them won the head of household. James is somewhat of a snake, so he might have done it too, but Natalie was not working with Nicole and Corey, and James was, so she was the better option to go along with something like that, if that was the route they chose to go. Granted, neither of them had the votes, as Nicole and Corey were two of the three people voting, so they couldn't do much, but Victor and Paul did concede James should stay. Maybe Nicole and Corey would have voted Natalie out regardless of whether or not Victor and Paul were on board, but they really wanted to keep them on their side in case Paul won, so they might not have been bold enough to blindside Paul and Victor if they had stuck to their guns. So was it the right choice for Corey and Nicole? Absolutely. Whether or not Nicole and James had a pregame deal, they've had each other's back all game. I'm not even 100% certain Nicole would vote out James if she won Final 3 head of household with James and Corey as the other two house guests. And James seems similarly loyal if he won head of household. He would have almost certainly put up Paul and Victor. Natalie wouldn't have. So Nicole and Corey absolutely made the right choice, and were smart to get Victor and Paul to agree with it, rather than to blindside them. So on to the final bit of business, the nominations. Corey won head of household, and Victor and Paul clearly thought Corey would honor their Final Four alliance. Victor and Paul ended up very disappointed. I thought Nicole and Corey really might have honored the Final Four deal at first, but the temptation to take out one of the two biggest targets other than James was too great, and Victor and Paul went up. Was it the right choice? Most likely. If one of them ends up in the Final Two with James at this point, that might cost them the vote for Victor and Paul. But if Nicole and Corey go to the Final Two together, then obviously Victor and Paul have to vote for one of them. So while it was ruthless gameplay, I say it was probably the right call. Victor and Paul are clearly hurt by it, saying they would have stayed loyal if they won, but truthfully, we don't know that. They briefly talked about doing the same thing to Nicole and Corey if Paul won this week's head of household, so just because they're saying it now when no one can prove they wouldn't, doesn't mean they are telling the truth. So who will go? Well, if Victor doesn't win veto, his luck will finally run out, I'm almost certain. And no more buybacks this time. I'm not as sure as some people that Victor can win in the Final Two. He's well liked by the house guests, but I don't know that the jury will be as impressed as the fans are with him only being around because he won 2 buybacks. It makes a great story, but fans seem to think he's the only one playing because he wins competitions. But winning competitions is seldom the defining factor. It can help, but while it makes good TV, it's not always a sign of good gameplay. Yes, he has kept him from voting him out by winning when he needed to, but I and many others would argue that if you were playing better, you wouldn't keep having to win competitions just to stay another week. Comp beasts seldom win because they make huge targets, so it's not a great winning strategy. Fans love that strategy because it's entertaining to watch, and production wants people to be comp beasts for just that reason, so they sell them as being better players than they actually are. It's what I call the Frank principle. But even if Victor is not as good a chance to win as Paul is, Victor has a better chance to win a household or veto in the Final Four and muck up their plans. And he's a likely candidate if he is in the Final 3 to win the final head of household, which would obviously mean Nicole and Corey would not both make it to Final 2, even if they were the last two standing against Victor. So for obvious reasons, they want Victor gone, and short of winning veto, there's not a lot he can do about it. As is the case with most of his fellow comp beasts, it's finally caught up with Victor. Well, that's it for this review. Tuesday we'll be covering who goes home from Corey's head of household, and then on Wednesday they'll be doing a quick week as the nominations, veto, and eviction will happen with the Final 4. I'll be back soon after that for my thoughts on those episodes and on the Final 3, whoever that will be. Thanks for watching. I'm Dan the Man, and I'll see you next time.